Okay, everybody, welcome to Supplemental lesson. This semester we've had, I think, missed 3 classes due to holidays and my own absence one time for sickness. So we're going to go over the Heptameron and Candide and the Enlightenment and autobiography. So we have 4 topics to finish, so let's get going. As you know, I like to start with our own beliefs, so I'd like you to write and answer this question in your notebook. You don't need to share it with anyone, obviously. The question is, if and when you get married, what will motivate you to marry someone? So you can pause the movie, and when you've written some kind of answer, it doesn't have to be long, restart the movie. I'm going to go on. That should be interesting. Story 1 and story 2. Okay. The author, him or herself, can be reduplicated. This makes evident the fictionality of all narrative, even historical narrative. So here we have our author, and our author as a person on the outside, as a narrator on the inside, and as a character on the very inside. So knowing that making obvious that there's different levels of the author makes us more conscious of the fact that this is a fiction, that this is not reality. These are words that provoke a sense of reality in us. Author, narrator, character, just like that. If you count the soap boxes on the wall, it seems like they go on forever, but you can probably count 7 or 8. Okay, the frame narrative. So this is an optical illusion. It's called the Drost effect. Its philosophical implications are referred to as recursion. This is a Drost. This is a box of cocoa. If you look at the servant, the woman with the cocoa, she's holding a tray, and on the tray is a box with a picture of herself holding the same tray, and so on. It goes on and on. And there's also a picture of her on the cup. So it's oddly, doubly reduplicative. Drost is just the name brand of cocoa, and so the name of this effect, this optical illusion, comes from the brand name of the cocoa. Here's one I grew up with. It's called Land O'Lakes butter. If you look, the squaw holding the box of butter has a box of butter, and on top of that box is another squaw, and so on. So apparently infinitely continuing, but of course not in reality. Here is another optical illusion. If you put your finger on the screen and follow any of the staircases, you'll find that where it leads defies gravity. Right? This is an impossible reality. So, conclusion 1. Putting a frame around something changes the way you see it and value it. Here's some examples. If you take this frame, which is nice gilt or gold-edged frame, and you put it around cartoons, you get fine art. The image you see is a cartoon, but it's actually an oil painting by Roy Lichtenstein, who was a modern artist. And he painted panels just like this, and they're hanging in museums with gold gilt frames in the Modern Art Museum of New York or wherever, in St. Louis where I grew up, and so on. If you take this and frame it like this, you get commercial junk. Now, I know that today comic books are considered high culture, but this is a relatively recent phenomenon. When I was a kid, comic books were just considered ephemera. Ephemera means things you just throw out. You read it once and you throw it out. You certainly don't save it. So look, it's the same style of drawing. Here we also have a cartoon comic book airplane with speech bubbles, and this was considered commercial junk. So it depends on how you frame it, what kind of context you set something into. The frame helps determine the meaning. It changes the way you see it and value it. Okay, the difference between these 2 similar airplanes is the social frame, right? This frame turns words into literature. The Norton Anthology, by virtue of being in the anthology, we take it to be fine art, fine literary art. This frame turns words into vandalism, so you could take something from the Norton, put it on this wall, and go to jail for it. This frame turns words into their opposite. A wink is a signal of irony, which means don't take what I'm saying seriously. That's a frame. So what does a frame do? Well, it's not so easy to explain. The famous sociologist Georg Simmel said, maybe a frame delineates the real from the unreal. So you put a painting inside that frame and you get creative license to do whatever you want because we know it's not real. Unreal. See that? And by saying this isn't real, it's like the phenomenon that we saw with the fool in Fuente Ovejuna. The fool, by virtue of being a fool, can say anything. And by virtue of being art, you can say anything. So here, then, which one is real? The character, the narrator, or the author? Think about it. Take a second, pause the video, write it in your notebook. Which one do you think is real? Character, narrator, author? All of them, none of them, one of them, you decide. Conclusion 2. Turtles all the way down, or indeterminacy and recursion. Turtles all the way down refers to a folktale, I think from the Pacific Islands. The world lies on the back of a giant turtle, and someone asked the question of someone who was telling this myth, well, what's underneath the turtle? Like, okay, if the world rests on a giant turtle, what's underneath the turtle? And the answer was, well, it's more turtles. And then after that, it's just turtles all the way down. That's called recursion. Recursion is also called an infinite regress. When philosophers in ancient Greece and early Christianity were trying to decide what God is, and they said God, everything has a cause. So go back to the first cause. What started the first cause? I'm caused by my parents. My parents were caused by something, and so on, all the way back to the very first cause. Something must have started the whole thing in process. Well, that would be God. That's how the early Christian medieval philosophers define God. That's one of the ways. So we don't really know who Marguerite de Navarre was any more than Parlamente, her fictional counterpart, nor the word portrait of Marguerite than Parlamente creates. So really, we don't really have that much information on any of them. In fact, the only information we really have on any of them is words. So is the quote-unquote real Marguerite de Navarre, is she really any more real than the character? I don't know. Maybe not. We could call all of it indeterminate. So we're talking about a frame narrative. Since there are multiple narrators, the late medieval, early Renaissance frame narrative is, in this sense, postmodern, in the sense that it highlights the lack of a single certain truth guaranteeing all other truths. The postmodern condition is just that. We no longer have a clear interpretation. There isn't a perfectly right and perfectly wrong. It's just a question of perspective. That's the postmodern condition. And so from our perspective, from our 21st century perspective, even from a late 20th century perspective, something like the Heptameron seems very sophisticated. It's like one of those, it's like a very smart movie whose ending is open. In the same way, we see that though appearing infinite, there are a limited number of squaws on the butter box and maidens on the drost box, and that all of them were painted by an artist. You see, it's an illusion, right? If you look closely, there's really only 2 squaws, and there's really only, I guess, 3 cocoa maidens, although the illusion makes it seem like they're infinite, right? Look closely. You can really only see 2 Indian women. And I guess you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 4 women on the drost box. The big one, the one in the box, the one in the box of the box, and the one in the mug. Right? And if you get close enough, it's just gibberish. It's nothing. The small one is nothing. It just blobs. So it's an illusion. It's not real. It's the illusion of reality. And this is a very important lesson for you guys as sophomores in literature. This goes back to Aristotle's mimesis. Aristotle said literature is an imitation of an action, or we've taken literature to be an imitation of life, but it's really an illusion, right? It's not really an imitation of life. It's a code that makes you think you're viewing life. So in the end, it's an illusion. It's a fiction. Okay. Here's a quotation from the Heptameron. Love, so we're going to change gears here. We're going to talk about love. Love may exist without jealousy, although this is rare. But jealousy may exist without love. So, love and jealousy, how do they go together? Do you want your boyfriend or girlfriend to be jealous? Is that a good thing, a bad thing? So here's a question. Is this love? Is this love? Courtly love. Now what we see depicted in the Heptameron is courtly love, a set of social and literary conventions in which men pledge to, quote-unquote, serve women. We've seen this before. If you look at the picture in the upper right, a man is pledging to serve a woman. Notice that she is seated like a queen and he is seated like, he is kneeling like a servant or a subject. Is this really love? So I asked you, if and when you get married, what will motivate you to marry someone? So you can think about your answer now. Courtly love, here's a definition, is a heterosexual, conjugal love, often outside the bounds of marriage. Yes, outside the bounds of marriage, at least in literature. It is passionate, carnal love that often involves two men and one woman. We call it a love triangle. Two men and one woman. Love is depicted as a sickness or a madness. So you can think of our second semester in Western literature, in which we saw that love in the Middle Ages was depicted as a kind of sickness or illness. There has been a debate among scholars whether this ever really existed or if it was merely a literary convention. Many scholars believe that not only did it exist, but that it resulted from certain specific socio-economic conditions, including an abundance of disinherited second and third sons who, like Amador, took to arms and serving ladies at court. So this is the story of Amador, whose name means lover. And he's Spanish in the way, because Spanish were considered to be passionate people. These stereotypes still exist. Courtly love was erotic, but not necessarily sexual. So yes, there was always the intimation of sexual fulfillment, but often no fulfillment. In fact, the whole point of courtly love was the tease, was the heightening of desire. This kind of love was considered to elevate one's soul. So if a man serves a woman selfishly, it was supposed to elevate his soul. But I think, as we pointed out in class, probably no one is willing to love someone else for absolutely nothing in return. Courtly love reveals several philosophical and religious influences, including Plato's Symposium, in which Socrates maintains that one ascends a hierarchy of love, the top of which is characterized by love of the good, which is not physical. You'll remember the Symposium, you'll remember that there were different arguments about what love is, and that Socrates' argument was that it's love is a ladder, and one ascends from physical love to love of a certain quality in a person, to love that quality in every person, to love of the quality itself, for itself. Another influence in courtly love is Catharism and the Catholic Church. This strain of Christianity rejected the pleasures of the flesh. So courtly love recognizes the pleasures of the flesh, insofar as a man desires a woman, but the myth of courtly love, the woman apparently has no fleshly desire for the man, and the man never fulfills his fleshly desire for the woman. So it reflects this tension between the body and the soul, and it favors the idea that we don't fulfill our appetites, don't fulfill our desires. Courtly love also reveals influences from Germanic practices of concubinage. Before the church took hold of the institution of marriage, the Germanic tribespeople who were living in Europe would, if you live together, you're basically married. In fact, in some places in the world, if you like some places in South America, if you cohabitate, you live in the same place with someone for more than, I think it is 3 years or maybe 1 year, then you have certain legal obligations to each other because you're considered, at least in part, married, even though you never went to church and got a marriage certificate. From the 12th century, the church had taken control of the institution of marriage. Marriage was an overtly economic arrangement designed to consolidate family landholdings. So in the Middle Ages, marriage was not exactly the romantic thing we see today. Today, marriage is still economic, but the economic reality in the West is usually covered in the ideology of romantic love. And the ideology of romantic love is a modern reflex or a descendant of medieval courtly love. Now, here in Taiwan, it's a little bit different. People are much more aware of the economic realities of a relationship. In fact, for a Westerner, Taiwan, the idea of buying your bride is insulting and crass. The idea that your relationship has financial limits would also be offensive to most Westerners, because in the West, the myth of courtly love is completely dominant. Even though there's like a 48% divorce rate, the myth is you find the one that's right for you and you live happily ever after. But the myth is so strong that it denies the fact that 48% results in failure. Now, Renaissance writers adopted the courtly love conventions of medieval narrative. Take a look at these pictures. If you look at these pictures, these pictures are of Teresa of Avila, or in Spanish, Teresa de Jesus, was a Catholic nun who lived, and I can't remember the dates, I want to say 1515, was it 1515 to 1560? I can't remember. The first part of the 16th century, and this is a sculpture by Bernini. If you look on the left image, you see the whole sculpture. On the right, you see close-ups from two angles of her face. Religious writers of the Renaissance wrote of their relationship with God in terms of courtly love. So Teresa de Jesus, who wrote her own autobiography and wrote poems, depicted her own relationship with God as a passionate, carnal, conjugal, romantic relationship. And from her prose, she describes a moment when God, quote-unquote, pierced her heart with an arrow of love. And Bernini, knowing her autobiography, makes a sculpture that depicts that moment from her autobiography. So you see in the left image, there's Cupid, who's love, she's a personification of love, with an arrow in his hand, and he's going to pierce her heart. And notice that she has her heart pierced, her expression looks like an orgasm, right? The half-closed eyes, the gaping mouth, these are all expressions of ecstasy. So Teresa is depicted as a kind of ecstasy, right? And it's a very physical ecstasy, a sexual ecstasy. So courtly love gets mixed in with religious poetry. Remember, we said that service to a woman was supposed to elevate the soul. So we're on the same track that was started by Socrates so long ago. Someone picked up that track and just delivered it forward and carried it further forward, developed it further. Okay, what does Teresa's face show? Ecstasy. In the movie. Sorry, my slides are going crazy. Which of the following two fall in love? The bird or the couple in the movie with Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep? Yes, it's a very old movie, I know. Which of the two fall in love? Well, you'd be right if you said the people on the right side, but you wouldn't be wrong if you said the bird. Both people, human beings and avian and birds, fall in love. Avian species' biological mechanisms are associated with the same neural mechanisms of attractions and attachment as human beings. Yes, apparently, even birds fall in love. And if you remember about penguins, penguins pick a mate for life and even gift each other with a wedding gift, a rock, apparently, that they keep. Here's a quotation from a biological anthropologist who's gotten a lot of press in the past 10 years, Catherine Fisher. She writes, "Courtship attraction is characterized in mammals by increased energy, focused attention, obsessive following, affiliative gestures, possessive mate guarding, and motivation to win a preferred mating partner." In other words, all the kinds of things we've seen in love poetry and in courtly love are all things that we share with other mammals, like this mammal on the bottom right. So imagine, that guy has the same kind of romantic infatuations, at least to some degree, that you and I might have. That's pretty shocking. So, here's a question. Is there more to courtship than the dopaminergic reward pathways is story 10, a story about dopamine response. The dopaminergic reward pathway is the way biologists are currently explaining love. They're saying it's an evolutionary chemical response to make sure we mate with someone and make new people so the species survives. So here's a question to you. Is all of our cultural response simply built on top of a biological need? I don't know. You can think about that. There's the dopamine production center right there. Well, for some people, we might say this approach would be biological determinism, scientism, or material reductionism. The idea that all we are and all we do culturally, morally, religiously, and ethically can be explained by science. Some people might say that's reductive. It simplifies too much. It places too much faith and matter. Remember, here in our Western tradition, we have Christianity as a as an ancestor, as a descendant of Platonism. And Plato said you can't trust the senses. They're only going to give you an imperfect impression of what reality is. Everything here is an imperfect version of something better, right? So we have double twin tracks in Western culture. We have the Platonistic idealism on the one side, and we talked about Kant. He was also an idealist. He's a transcendental idealist. You have those guys on the one side. We have Berkeley as an idealist on that side. And on the other side, you have science. They are kind of opposed. So, if I haven't given you these words, and I think I have, I want to give you a few different words for love. There's eros, there's amor, there's caritas, and there's agape. These are 4 big words we use, 4 common words and different words we use for love in the West. The word love is from the Old English. Eros is a Greek word. It means erotic love. It's about passion and physical love. Remember, in ancient Greece, there was nothing shameful about physical love. Amor is romantic love or emotional love. It's about obsession and dedication to a single person. That's a Latin word. Caritas is also a Latin word. It's charity. It means service to others based on affiliation or ties of loyalty. Agape is a Greek word, and it means unconditional love. It's about altruistic beneficence. So altruistic beneficence means you're trying to do good for other people with absolutely no expectation of a reward, right? Directed to others without any thought of recompense, as I wrote here. Okay, eros, amor, caritas, agape. So, when we read about science today, so we're all literature people, but we're at a university, and our university is funded mostly by the sciences. And the sciences are going to tell us that love is having to do with dopamine and our brain chemistry. So here's a question for you. Is eros, amor, caritas, and agape, are they nothing more than dopamine responses? Is it nothing more than brain chemicals firing? To what extent are they cultural and to what extent biological? I obviously cannot answer that, but it's something you need to think about. You need to think about what role the years you're investing in this study is based on biology and how independent our field of literature really is from the sciences and how dependent we are. Those are big questions, I know. But I like to give long-term homework, so this is your homework for the next 10 years. Okay, these are some discussion questions by Exhortatio Openjangi ad fontes. I think I have some discussion questions following, but as humanists, we always go to the source. We get it for ourselves. We don't take someone's second impression or interpretation. We go to the source, ad fontes, to the. We're going to move on to other topics. You can, of course, pause the movie at any time and make your own notes. All right, so we're going to come back to the Enlightenment, and here's a bit of inspiration from one of my favorites, Theophrastus Paracelsus von Hohenheim. Study without respite that the art may become perfect in us. Now, why does he say study without respite? Does he have no mercy? Does he want you not to have a social life? No. Do I want you not to have a social life? No. Paracelsus here is saying, and I'm saying through him, simply that if we study, we can find answers. If we study, we can find answers. This is the basic call of the Renaissance. This is the basic crystallization of it in the Enlightenment. Don't give up. Don't give up. There's an answer to every problem. Just because you might be the first to come up with the answer doesn't mean the answer isn't there, and doesn't mean it's not the right answer for everybody. So don't be afraid. If you're a Christian, you can think of the passage in the Gospels where it says, knock and it shall be opened unto you. In other words, Jesus said, don't give up. Keep asking, keep knocking, keep searching. So we were talking about the Enlightenment, and I have a question for you. How does the following quotation from the American Declaration of Independence reflect Enlightenment political ideals? So here's a quotation from one of the founding documents of my nation. Let me read this to you. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I've highlighted in red keywords: truths, self-evident, all men are created equal, unalienable rights. Obviously, in a society like the Middle Ages, where there are classes, where you are noble by birth, no matter what you do, you'll always be noble, or you're poor by birth, and you'll always be poor, they do not hold the belief that all men are created equal. They believe that some men are created with quote-unquote blue blood, that they are superior. In fact, if you read some of the stories, even Cervantes wrote a story in which a princess is lost from her family, and she grows up among gypsies, but she's genetically, well, we would say genetically, she seems so different from them because she's blue-blooded, she's noble. So she's much kinder and much better and more beautiful and more pure than everybody around her, and everybody knows it because she's noble, and the belief was that it's all about your blood, right? All right, we've talked about unalienable rights, we've talked about liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and here we have a new one: just powers from the consent of the governed. Well, this is radical. So powers have to be just, right? They don't get to do what they want. They have to serve justice, and they can only govern if they have the consent or the will or the right, if they have the permission of those that they're ruling. Okay, so you can think more about that on your own. What do I want to say here? Oh, right. So I think I mentioned this in class. New political ideas in the Enlightenment are partly the result of America. Yes, not the United States, but the Americas, I should say, North, South, and Central. New political ideas derive in part from a fundamentally different concept of man that emerged in the 18th century. So here in the Enlightenment, in the 18th century, we have a radically new idea of what a human being is. Part of the way this idea changed is because of the encounter between the indigenous Americans and the Europeans. You see, I'll give you guys a key to life. You can only know yourself through other people. That's it. You can only know yourself through other people. Aristotle said it this way: we are social animals. You will find that as you meet other people that make you extremely happy or extremely unhappy, those are the people that are most reflecting to you your own either neglected or celebrated parts of yourself. That probably doesn't make any sense to you now. Write it in your notebook and think about it, and call me when you're middle ages, and call me when you're middle aged, and let me know if I was right. Let's talk about the Americas, and let's talk about how a sense of human being changed. Okay, John Locke in 1690 wrote an essay. It was called, a book, a treatise, a philosophical treatise. It was called Essay Concerning Human Understanding. In this treatise, John Locke, the English philosopher, proposed that all knowledge comes from experience. All knowledge comes from experience. This is called empiricism, and all experience comes from the senses. So all knowledge comes from experience rather than suppose some ideas are innate. This is called tabula rasa, or blank slate. So Locke said, we're born empty, and it's only by our life experience that we know anything. Nothing is built in. This idea develops into the concept of the noble savage. The noble savage suggests that man is inherently good, but is corrupted by false education or civilization. Note, the idea of a noble savage is opposite Augustine's concept of original sin. It's opposite the idea of Adam and Eve, that we are all born essentially flawed. It is opposite the idea that there was a golden age, then a silver age, then a bronze age, and then an age of degeneration, which is where we are. The ancient idea is that things used to be great, now they're terrible. The Enlightenment turns all of that 180 degrees and says everything is getting better. And the only reason anything is bad is because we've had false education. Now remember my slide on Immanuel Kant from last week, from earlier today actually. He said we were immature, and that enlightenment is about growing up. Okay? Noble savage. The noble savage. So where did this idea of the noble savage come from? Well, the French philosophe Diderot wrote about Bougainville's journey to Tahiti and the fact that the Tahitians seemed to be more civilized than Europeans. They became the model for the noble savage. So just like Montaigne wrote in his essays that some of the Americans seem to be more noble and less savage than the Europeans, who are far superior technologically and have more education, so did Bougainville write that Tahitians, the people in Tahiti, seem to be more civilized than the Europeans. And that became the idea that, well, maybe people, when they're less educated, are actually better to us and superior to us. They're more pure, like children are pure. Right? So here's a picture of Bougainville journey to Tahiti. Now this idea of a noble savage is still very much alive today. This Enlightenment idea has not gone away. Here's an advertisement from a long time ago in the United States. Well, not that long ago. Long ago enough to be before your life, but I remember it. It says, get involved now, pollution hurts all of us. Get involved now, pollution hurts all of us, not just me. So who's talking? A Native American, right? A Native American. The idea is that the Native Americans took really good care of America, and that the European civilizations that settled thereafter, i.e. the European descended people and the Taiwanese descended people and all the people that live in a modern society now, were the ones responsible for the pollution and for ruining America. So here you have the image of a noble savage, and he's weeping because we've hurt nature. Now, if you know anything about the native peoples, they did live more in harmony with nature, but they also practiced brutality like human sacrifice. So I don't know if we can say they were more noble than we are. I can say they polluted less, but they also were living in the Stone Age. So I think Stone Age Europeans or Stone Age Asians would also pollute a lot less than we would, because they had nothing but stones as their highest technology. So what can you say about that? Okay, we're back to my most favorite picture in the whole world. This is from Funai. These are the native, uncontacted native peoples of Brazil. Now, so we're talking about the noble savage. Remember this picture I showed you? This is one of the same group. So this is the airplane in Brazil flying over part of the Amazon basin, where there are native peoples that have never had any contact with civilization, supposedly. Not sure if that's exactly true, but it's mostly true. Now, what's their response? They're shooting arrows at the airplane. So if the noble savage is so pure and so great, here's a question for you. Would you invite these tribesmen to your house? Hey guys, you want to come over for dinner? I don't think so. They don't have a sense of private property. For all you know, they might steal your mother or your sister, and they might just think that's just fine. Or they might kill someone if they get mad. We don't even know what their sense of right and wrong is. And as you can tell, we probably don't agree with much of their culture, right? Their culture would be radically different from ours, and I would be willing to suppose that we'd be very disappointed if we tried to integrate with them. Right. This is from the Fundação Nacional do Índio, FUNAI, from Brazil. Okay. So we're still talking about what is the Age of Enlightenment. Well, let's talk about what is the Age of Enlightenment in terms of our text, Candide. So the image on the right is exactly what you think it is. It's someone getting kicked in the rear for not taking good notes. I'm just kidding. The joke is probably really stale by now. It's Candide being kicked out of this house for having feelings for a girl, right? Candide, on whom nature had bestowed the perfection of gentle manners, including an honest mind and great simplicity of heart, is a figure for the noble savage. So Candide himself is a kind of noble savage. The word Candide means sort of sincere, right? Like, so he's so sincere. When Pangloss says, hey, this is the best of all possible worlds, Candide is so sincere and so helpful, he just memorizes it and says, yes, I guess you're right. So Candide is a kind of noble savage. Now, judging from Candide, what does Voltaire think of the concept of noble savage? So you can work in groups of 3 or 4. Well, we're not going to work in groups of 3. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to go through the text now and send a text message to one of your friends in the class. And you answer the question, what does Voltaire think of the concept of the noble savage? Okay? Find something in the text and you send that to your friend. You can pause the movie now and do that now, and I'm going to continue, assuming that you've done that work. Now let's talk about science and reason. Now we're really getting to the heart of it. Well, if the human mind is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, then education is the chief vehicle by which virtue and happiness are created. Right? So if we're born absolutely blank-minded, which by the way our science no longer believes, we do have instincts and drives, but in the enlightened they thought there was just nothing there, then how do you control what kind of person someone becomes? Well, throughout their education. The empirical tendencies that sprouted in the Renaissance bloomed into the Enlightenment. So what we're seeing here is something I've said in class. What started in the Renaissance crystallizes in the Enlightenment. Let me talk about Kant a little bit more. German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, wrote in his Critique of Pure Reason that everything must submit to criticism. That's a remarkable thing. Everything must submit to criticism. Remember, in the Middle Ages, you could not criticize the Bible. Even today, in certain societies, you cannot criticize the Bible. There are many things that you cannot touch and cannot criticize. Even today, you cannot walk down certain places in the United States and criticize certain things, or you could be liable for treason. I mean, there is free speech, but there's limits. So Kant said everything must submit to criticism, including religion, which through its holiness commonly seeks to exempt itself from it, and that religion should be made open and free to public examination. This is a radical claim, to say that life philosophy that people have lived by for millennia should be open to attack. You can imagine how much society had changed for him to be able to write that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about science. Oh, by the way, what I'm implying here in that last slide is that if you're open to criticizing religion, you're opening the way for science. Now, there are 3 great famous names for Enlightenment science. That's Bacon, Locke, and Newton. Bacon, Locke, and Newton. Sounds like a law firm. All of these were empiricists. All 3, Bacon, Locke, and Newton, believe that knowledge comes from experience, which is derived in turn from sensation. So everything we know comes through our eyes, our nose, our mouth, our sense of touch, and our hearing, our ears. This is Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626. He was an English statesman and a man of letters. Why are we looking at Francis Bacon? Well, he's the father of modern science in a way. Bacon opposed the idea of designing experiments to confirm what one believed. Yes, if you can believe it, they used to make experiments and rig them so that you could confirm what you already believed to be true. Science does the opposite. We say, we think this is true, let's check it, let's verify it, let's doubt it. Bacon preferred to gather facts and avoid theoretical conclusions until they were inevitable. So Bacon gathered facts. Start with the facts. Bacon popularized inductive experiments, which we now call the scientific method. Inductive means you go from particular truths to a general rule, right? A general rule is something like the theory of evolution, or a general rule is like a definition of literature. So he would start from particular experiences and then go to the general rule. That's the scientific method. John Locke is another great name in the history of Enlightenment science. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, was an English philosopher and physician, doctor. He was one of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers. He was the one who formulated the idea that all knowledge comes ultimately from sense perception. As we've said, so Locke was the one who came up with this idea that everything we know comes from the senses, which is a radical contradiction of Platonism, including Neoplatonism, including Christianity. Locke argued against the Augustinian notion of original sin and against the Cartesian notion that we are inherently logical. So not only was Locke opposed to the church fathers like St. Augustine, but also opposed to Descartes, who thought that our reason was enough. Okay, and Isaac Newton, a really interesting character, was also a very important figure in Enlightenment science. He was an English physicist and mathematician, and actually, his last job in life he was just as good at. He worked at the Mint, at the Royal Mint, making money. He was brilliant. He was hard to get along with, like Steve Jobs. Newton combined Cartesian rationality and mathematicality with a Baconian experimental method. Math with experimentation. Newton's major work, Principia Mathematica, laid the foundation for gravitation and planetary motion. Pretty major contribution. He explained how gravity works and how the planets worked. That's not bad for one lifetime. Since Newton used advanced calculations, which we now call calculus, which he invented himself, he left no doubt that the solar system is heliocentric. So Newton was one of the ones that pointed out to us that our solar system is 8 planets revolving around a star. Now, the universe described by Newton was mechanistic and seemed to run by itself. This left little room for the traditional Christian notion of God, who then became conceived as some kind of clockmaker who, once he creates a clock, allows it to run by itself. This is called deism as opposed to theism. Theism, as you know, is the belief in an entity, a supercosmic entity that exists outside of us and is separate from us, but is involved in our lives in some mysterious way. Deism is the same belief, with the exception that this God is not involved in our lives. He's just watching from the outside. Oops. Yes, oops indeed. This obviously changes everything about religion, because how can you pray to a God for some kind of intervention if you no longer believe that God gets himself involved in our affairs? Right? Here's an image of deism. So God would be the clockmaker, and the clock is our world, just ticking away by itself. Maybe once in a while he intervenes to fix something, but basically does nothing. See, that is quite this. Okay? Explain that. Right. So the way Western culture has always answered that, how can there be evil in the world if God is all-knowing and created the world? This is the way he answers. Free will. This is the Western cultural answer even today. Free will. The answer is God gave us free will. Why? Because if he forced us to be good, it wouldn't be worth it. What kind of person would we be if we were forced to be good? Well, that's kind of strange. That's kind of like saying, what kind of a runner would you be if you didn't have legs? Okay, now Candide, the work, considers and satirizes several well-known philosophical positions. The chief butt of the satire is Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz. Sorry, there's a typo. It should be von Leibniz. Leibniz, not Con Leibniz, who took his turn at answering the problem of evil in 1710 in his work Theodicee, Theo meaning God and Dike meaning justice. Leibniz's response is that a greater good was being upheld in the apparent evil of the world. Now, Leibniz is not such a dum-dum as Voltaire makes him out to be, but his basic position was that we can't really figure it out with our human mind. But God is taking care of everything, and everything is good. Augustine of Hippo, Catholic saint and church father whom we read in semester 2, developed the doctrine of original sin, which explains in Voltaire's words, "What? To be driven out of a delightful garden where one could have lived forever if one hadn't eaten an apple?" Yes. The Manichees, they were a Christian group at the time of Augustine. They explain evil simply by positing a god of dark to accompany and compete with the god of light. So if there's evil in the world and good, that must mean there's two gods. This ancient religion died out, but the idea received interest in the Enlightenment after Peter Bale's 1697 Dictionnaire historique et critique, in which he concluded that the problem of evil could not be solved without limiting God. He claimed the Manichees were on to something. So as you'll notice, ideas come back. They might seem to die out, but they always come back. English poet Alexander Pope wrote in his very popular philosophical poem Essay on Man that God sends not ill if rightly understood, and that private ills are universal good. So Pope was, his answer to the problem of evil or theodicy was the same as Leibniz, that if you rightly understand, you'll see that what seems evil isn't, and that what might be bad for you, maybe it's good for everyone else. And here's a quotation from Pope's poem, Essay on Man. All discord, harmony not understood, all partial evil, universal good, and, spite of pride and erring reason's spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right. That's Essay on Man, Epistle 1. So, we're still talking about theodicy and what is the message of Candide. Well, since the first centuries of Christianity, theologians held a concept of God different than that of what is held in the temple gods in Taiwan. God is taken to be formless, beyond conception, and limitless. This is the basic idea of God, according to theologians. Formless, beyond conception, we can't imagine God, and limitless. Scholastic theologians, in other words, the Catholic philosophers of the Middle Ages, said that the only way to talk about God was by a via negativa. I'm sorry, there's a spelling mistake. The negativa should end with an A. A via negativa says we can only say negative things of God, like God is not limited. God is not this and not that. What can be positively said of God is true but general. That God is omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. So basically, God is so infinite that we can only say very general things about him, like he's everywhere, has all power, and he knows all things. We can't say anything specific about him other than through a negative. So, again, getting back to the theodicy, getting back to the question of evil, if God is omniscient, God is all-knowing, he always knows what's going to happen, and he's outside of time, so he knew what was going to happen throughout all history. He must know the future. So how could he allow evil to arise in the world? Why would he create a world that he knew would turn corrupt? Asked another way, if God is omnipotent, why does he allow evil to continue to exist? If you haven't read Robinson Crusoe, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful and influential work. It's one of my all-time favorites. There's a character, Robinson Crusoe is an Englishman who gets stranded on a desert island and recreates all civilizations single-handedly. He acquires a slave, which he doesn't call a slave. He requires a dark-skinned man who is his kind of servant, and he calls him Friday because he met him on a Friday. And Friday, he Christianizes him. And of course, Friday is very happy to become a Christian, as you would expect in this kind of a book. And Friday naively and pointedly asks Robinson Crusoe, if God much strong, much might is devil, why God no kill the devil, and make no more do wicked? So Friday, who's got no education, says, if God is all powerful and God even created the devil, why does he let the devil cause evil? And why does he just wipe out all evil? He's got that power. And that's the problem of theodicy. Now the question implies an argument against the existence of God, which was worse than heresy, which is why Friday says it and not Robinson Crusoe. Answers to the problem of evil varied, but one variety of answer resembles what Mahayana Buddhists say of this world, that we are too corrupt or deluded to see things as they really are, which is perfect. So one of the answers is that things really are perfect, but we are so corrupt we can't see. As I think I mentioned in class today, the problem of evil arose from the beginning of the Judeo-Christian monotheistic tradition. This is a picture of the book of Job, right? The problem of evil arises, right? Job poses this problem. What if you have a really good man? He's really perfect, but he's in a human world. Why does he suffer? And so Job poses this question, and the answer is, don't ask. In the book of Job, God allows Satan to make Job ill, and Job, after losing everything, asks God why and curses the day of his birth, if you will remember. God answers by thundering at Job, where were you when I loosed the springs beneath the oceans? Can you catch the Leviathan? The answer suggests that God, as ultimate reality, is beyond man's comprehension. Just as a 5-year-old would not likely understand a graduate course in Old English literature, though he has the potential at some future. Which is why Leibniz comes up with what he comes up with. An appeal to God's inscrutability is really the only reasonable position, because to sustain God's omnipotence and omniscience otherwise is unreasonable. So no theologian and no Christian worth his training would say that God is not all-powerful or that God is not all-knowing. Everyone agreed with that. So how do you explain evil? The only way to say God is omniscient and omnipotent and there's evil in the world is to say, well, it must be that we can't understand yet. God is inscrutable. We can't understand God. That's the only reasonable position. Now, Voltaire wrote an essay entitled Bien, tout est bien, which means something like good, everything is good, in 1764. He wrote in this essay that the origin of evil has always been a pit of which no one can see the bottom. So Voltaire himself admitted there's no good explanation for this. The problem of evil, the problem of theodicy. Now there's one other possibility to solve the problem of evil. And this is something that's maybe more common in the 21st century than it would have been at any other time during our courses. The other possibility to solve this problem is to reject the question. The question is wrong. That's why we can't get a good answer. So maybe the question of theodicy shows that the concept of God is not complete. Because if you believe that God is like a person, living in time, yet omnipresent and omniscient, then you automatically have a contradiction. Because people live in time and they change from day to day. So if you can do away with that concept, that human-like, that anthropomorphic concept of God, then maybe you can ask a better question when it comes to why people suffer. Okay, let's talk about Candide as literature briefly. Genre. What is the genre of Candide? Voltaire is clearly mocking novels, heroic tales, and romance, among other genres. Voltaire's Candide is a parody of the 18th century novel and satire of the 18th century philosophers and society. So, parody. What is parody? Well, Candide is a parody of many forms of literature current in Voltaire's time. A parody is an imitation. It's an incongruous imitation. It uses the form and the style of a genre to lower ends. So we could take a sonnet and write it about something like a toilet, how you love a toilet or something like this, and that would be a parody of a sonnet. As a story of the education of a character, Candide parodies such novels as Tom Jones. You might not know Tom Jones. It's a really good read. It's a Renaissance novel. What can I say other than it's a parody? As parodic fiction, Candide shares affinities with other great parodies such as Don Quixote or Orlando Furioso. Orlando Furioso was a Renaissance work that we didn't read. I'm not going to go into it now, but you can remember Don Quixote being a parody of what? Chivalric romance. Satire. What is satire? Satire is a literary art criticizing a subject by making it ridiculous and evoking toward it attitudes of amusement or contempt or scorn or indignation or something else. It differs from the comic in that comedy evokes laughter mainly as an end in itself, while satire derides. So the purpose of satire is to criticize. Laughter may be there, laughter may not be there. That is, it uses laughter as a weapon and against a butt that exists outside the work itself. Right? So satire is making fun of something that's not in the work itself. Indirect biography. This is part of the genre of Candide. Candide contains many references to experiences from Voltaire's life. Someone was asking about this today. And thus is also a kind of indirect biography. No, it is not an autobiography of Voltaire, but it has autobiographical elements. Characterization. What kind of characters are featured in Candide? Well, we would call them flat, stock characters. They suffer little of any change throughout the fiction, but instead revert back to their self-defining way of being. So this is part of the fun of Candide, that Pangloss is always the same way he always is, and Candide and so on. Really, people don't change very much. Maybe at the end. These characters are akin to caricatures and were inspired by the very popular Commedia dell'arte, the Italian Italian commedia dell'arte, which had a stock villain, a stock idiot, a stock hero. So, as you know, in some kinds of literature or opera or art, there are stock characters. They're always kind of the same. The bad guy's always kind of the same. Hollywood movies have a lot of stock characters. Okay. Discussion questions. I saw those today. Slideshow is stuck.